Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Grand Old Unraveling, the Republican Party, Donald Trump, and the Rise of Authoritarianism, by John Kenneth White. Narrated by Bob Johnson. What's Past is Prologue. William Shakespeare, The Tempest. Preface. The Gathering Storm. There are some things that you just can't imagine happening in your life. This is one of them. Mitt Romney accepting Donald Trump's endorsement, February 2nd, 2012. On February 2nd, 2012, Mitt Romney and his wife Ann mounted the stage at an opulent gold-plated Las Vegas hotel to accept a political endorsement. Unlike other routine testimonials, this one was different. The person making the endorsement was a controversial celebrity who had never held political office and had been, until recently, a member of the opposite party. Donald J. Trump calculated that the former Massachusetts governor was the likely 2012 Republican nominee, although as late as the day prior, many speculated that Trump would endorse Romney's erstwhile opponent, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. After all, Gingrich and Trump had much in common. Both had reputations for being rhetorical bomb throwers, were subjects of messy divorces, and shared a mutual contempt for their Democratic opponents. But Trump coldly calculated that Romney was a winner, calling him tough, sharp, and smart. The event took place in a circus-like atmosphere at the Trump-owned hotel, something that would become commonplace for Donald Trump's future rallies. The Romneys, both devout Mormons who adhered to that religion's strict moral codes, were decidedly uncomfortable in Trump's presence, as Mitt Romney candidly admitted to reporters covering the event. There are some things that you just can't imagine happening in your life. This is one of them. Ann Romney was even more discomfited, and she hurried off the stage at the earliest possible moment. Then New York Times reporter Mark Leibovich described how the candidate's wife's cheeks grew increasingly red through Mr. Trump's remarks, and she appeared on the verge of either laughter or terror during the whole show. Democrats mocked the Trump endorsement, and the Democratic National Committee issued a statement claiming both Romney and Trump enjoyed dismissing employees, citing Trump's signature line on the hit television show The Apprentice, "You're fired." John Lovett, a speechwriter for Barack Obama, tweeted, "I guess I'll take my lead from one of America's more garish and despicable figures." For many close observers of politics, the event became a subject of late-night laughs. David Letterman joked that Romney's decline in the polls was the inevitable after-effect of Trump's endorsement. But New York Times reporter Maggie Haberman recalled that Trump was energized by the event and wanted more appearances with Romney, a request the campaign rejected. Months earlier, Trump had regretfully announced that he would not seek the presidency, even as he boasted, "My potential candidacy continues to be validated by my ranking at the top of the Republican contenders in polls across the country." Days after Romney's loss to Barack Obama, Trump trademarked what would become his campaign slogan, "Make America Great Again," and his 2016 campaign for the Republican nomination began to unfold. A decade after Romney received this endorsement, after the tumultuous events of the Trump presidency, 2 impeachments, and an attempted coup, no one is laughing. Mitt Romney's discomfiture turned into scorn when he delivered a stinging rebuke of Trump in 2016, calling him a con man, a fake, and dismissively concluded, "Dishonesty is Donald Trump's hallmark." Democrats were in disbelief when Trump astonished the political world by beating Hillary Clinton, and few were amused when Trump cast aside accepted presidential norms of behavior, or when he was twice impeached, or when the U.S. Capitol was invaded by an angry mob on January 6, 2021. Even now, the threats to our democracy, which many believed would subside after Trump's 2020 defeat, remain. In 2022, nearly 300 Republican nominees for offices with the power to certify future elections either questioned the results of the 2020 election or believed the election was stolen. While many lost, Donald Trump continues to exercise unparalleled power within his own party, even as he is subjected to numerous criminal investigations and indictments. As this is written, Donald J. Trump is the leading contender to win the Republican nod in 2024, something only the defeated Richard M. Nixon achieved in the last 55 years. And Nixon's narrow victory in 1968 was due to the extraordinary circumstances of an unpopular war abroad and racial unrest at home. How did we get here? Some believe that an exhausted conservative agenda that was once revived by Ronald Reagan in 1980 had reached its natural death. Much of what Reagan did as president, enacting tax cuts, slowing the growth rate of federal spending, eliminating government regulations, and positioning the United States to defeat the Soviet Union, a country Reagan derisively referred to as the evil empire, now occupied dog-eared pages in dusty history books. The shop-worn question asked by admirers of the late president, "What would Reagan do?" was no longer relevant. By 2020, the paucity of conservative ideas was such that the grand old party, for the first time in its history, did not write a platform. The emerging issues of climate change, growing economic inequality, and post-Cold War overseas challenges have substantially altered the domestic political agenda. While Americans still distrust government and younger citizens hardly know a time when government worked effectively, when faced with a pandemic, most people wanted government to do more. Joe Biden ascended to the presidency, determined to make government work again. At the same time, the Reagan coalition, evangelical, white, married, middle class, and suburban, was eroding thanks to a multiracial, less religiously affiliated country whose younger voters cast ballots in even larger numbers for Democratic candidates. The white middle-class suburban Republican majority that gave Dwight D. Eisenhower, Richard M. Nixon, and Ronald Reagan historic landslide victories could no longer deliver. Just as Democrats celebrated Franklin D. Roosevelt and the New Deal long after their expiration dates, in 2016 Republicans were still honoring a deceased president and a tiresome agenda. Donald Trump saw the vacuum and filled it. In 1844, Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that in the United States, the Conservative Party, composed of the most moderate, able, and cultivated part of the population, is timid and merely defensive of property. It vindicates no right, it aspires to no real good, it brands no crime, it proposes no generous policy, it does not build, nor write, nor cherish the arts, nor foster religion, nor establish schools, nor encourage science, nor emancipate the slave, nor befriend the poor, or the Indian, or the immigrant. For Emerson, conservatives were a party of memory, enamored with the romanticism of the past and determined to preserve it. Liberals, said Emerson, had no such devotion, but instead were a party of hope. Freed from the constrictions of memory, they could inspire their followers to pursue new horizons and revolutionary beginnings. Emerson believed that while the best men were often found in a conservative movement, the best causes were those espoused by unshackled liberals. Political parties thrive when they embody both memory and hope. For Republicans, Ronald Reagan is the preeminent example of a successful politician who did both. Reagan summoned the happy memories of a prosperous and contented post-World War II era, a country bursting with energy, and an economic colossus whose city dwellers were boarding station wagons and moving into spanking new suburban homes. There was a boundless optimism that the 20th century would be, as Henry Luce predicted prior to the United States' entry into World War II, an American century. James Q. Wilson wrote the following description of Reagan country. Each family had a house. There it was for all to see and inspect. With a practiced glance, one could tell how much it cost, how well it was cared for, how good a lawn had been coaxed into uncertain life, and how tastefully plants and shrubs had been set out. These Sunday drive picture postcards became centerpieces for Reagan's consistent recitation of the homespun values embodied in family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom. But Reagan's appeal to a pleasantly remembered past was also accompanied by a firm belief that the future remained hopeful. Even after having been diagnosed with the Alzheimer's disease that would claim his life, Reagan issued a final farewell, ending with these words, "I know that for America there will always be a bright dawn ahead." But Emerson saw danger when parties became subject to the bidding of unprincipled leaders who reaped the rewards of the docility and zeal of the masses, which they direct. Inevitably, Emerson believed, parties of principle degenerate into personalities, which become a source of danger. By 2020, both major parties were animated by neither memory nor hope, but by fear. Most Republicans believe the memories they cherish can no longer be preserved. Emerson himself forecast that, with fading memories, conservatives had an instinctive proclivity to see society as sick, taking as low a view of every part of human action and passion. Today, it is this sickness, as Emerson predicted, that has got into the ballot box that Donald Trump and his progenitors so skillfully exploit. John Daniel Davidson writes that the animating values of individual rights, family values, and religious freedom have been lost to an ascendant left that has transformed America into a woke dystopia. This includes a redefinition of marriage, the First Amendment, any semblance of control over our borders, the fundamental distinction between men and women, and, especially of late, the basic rule of law. For Davidson, only two paths remain: awake from decades of slumber to reclaim and refound what has been lost, or watch our civilization die. It is this fear that all is lost, and that Republicans must use whatever means necessary to avoid being relegated to permanent minority status, or even political oblivion, that has prompted party-led efforts to suppress the vote and contest elections they did not win. In 1980, conservative Paul Weyrich told a gathering of evangelicals, "Our leverage in the elections goes up as the voting populace goes down." 6 years later, a ballot integrity initiative underwritten by the Republican National Committee tried to expunge an estimated 60,000 to 80,000 names from the voting rolls. An internal party memo stated that, if successful, the program would keep the black vote down considerably. In 1994, California Republican Michael Huffington refused to concede his U.S. Senate loss to Democrat Dianne Feinstein, citing overwhelming evidence of illegal ballots cast by undocumented immigrants. A Feinstein spokesperson denounced Huffington as a spoiled rich kid and a sour grapes loser. Only months later did Huffington issue a concession statement. In 1996, House Speaker Newt Gingrich charged, "We now have proof that a close congressional contest won by a Democrat was stolen thanks to a sufficient number of non-citizens voting." That same year, the Senate Rules Committee voted unanimously to accept the results of the Louisiana State Senate election that gave Democrat Mary Landrieu another 6-year term. Landrieu's opponent, Woody Jenkins, marketed brightly colored socks reading, "Don't get cold feet, sock it to voter fraud." But Jenkins's case collapsed when witnesses were allegedly schooled as to how they could invent stories of voter fraud. Eventually, 4 of Jenkins's 6 witnesses recanted their testimony. In 2000, Florida Republicans spurred an effort to purge thousands from the state's voter rolls, nearly all Democrats and half of them African American. David Basidas, a senior research associate at the Joint Center for Political and Economic Studies, concluded that the effort led by Republican Governor Jeb Bush and Secretary of State Katherine Harris was a patently obvious technique to discriminate against black voters. The program proved vitally important in securing the presidency for Bush's brother, George, when Harris certified his wafer-thin 537-vote victory over Al Gore in a state that decided the election. 22 years later, Florida Republican Governor Ron DeSantis created the Office of Election Crimes and Security and ordered the arrests of those with prior felony convictions who were issued voting cards. Making the announcement, DeSantis said, "They're going to pay the price." Those arrested faced up to 5 years in jail and a $5,000 fine. The arresting officers confessed that they had never encountered similar warrants. When did the Republican Party begin its transformation into a Trump-dominated party that many of its former members hardly recognize? Some believe it began in 1964 with the rise of Barry Goldwater and his rejection of Me Too New Dealism and his tacit embrace of the John Birch Society. Others cite Richard Nixon's embrace of the Southern Strategy in 1968, whose coded language transformed the party's historic commitment to civil rights into a largely white-dominated party that would find a home in the once Democratic South. Others believe it began with the ascent of Newt Gingrich to the House speakership. Gingrich's rise coincided with his use of loaded speech and the frustration of his fellow Republicans at the party's go-along-get-along approach to Democratic congressional leaders. In a 1990 memo titled Language, a Key Mechanism of Control, Gingrich advised Republicans to use words such as destructive, liberal, welfare, traitors, radical, anti-child, and corruption when describing their opponents, saying, "You're fighting a war. It is a war for power." Former Democratic Congressman Barney Frank recalled that Gingrich transformed American politics from one in which people presumed the goodwill of their opponents even as they disagreed, into one in which people treated the people with whom they disagreed as bad and immoral. He was a kind of McCarthyite who succeeded. Thanks to a combination of Newt-speak and the party's frustration with continually losing control of the House, Gingrich was Republicans' inevitable choice to assume the speakership in 1995. Gingrich once told his staff that his primary purpose in politics was not to legislate or win re-election, but to save Western civilization. In his book, The Deconstructionists, the 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party, Dana Milbank describes how the Republican Party, under Gingrich's leadership, morphed into its present-day form. Attacking political opponents and government bureaucrats during his presidency, Donald Trump employed his own version of Newt-speak, labeling them as bad, dirty, horrible, evil, sick, corrupt, lowlifes, and the crookedest, most dishonest, dirtiest people I've ever seen. But a longer view shows that for several decades the Republican Party contained the strands of Trump-like anti-democratic thinking that are now fully manifest. Those origins began with the 5 successive defeats of Republican presidential candidates, starting with Herbert Hoover's landslide loss in 1932 and ending with Thomas E. Dewey's surprising defeat in 1948. A close look at these contests reveal a frustrated party that latched onto conspiracy theories of foreign involvement that covertly assisted the Democrats, to nefarious actions by Democratic officials, to questioning whether ballots were properly counted, to blaming voters who were dependent on federal government programs for their losses. Even when Republicans won the presidency, the party establishment became so obsessed with winning that little was done to strengthen the party organization. Beginning with Dwight Eisenhower, Republican presidents treated the party as a kind of Hertz rent-a-car, used only for the purpose of gaining universal ballot access while building their own personal apparatuses, whose loyalties were to a single individual. For many Republicans, the joys of winning meant embracing a personal presidency whose occupants would float above the party, yet dominated, a phenomenon that would quickly envelop the Democrats. As one House Republican remarked after signing a petition challenging the 2020 election results, "The things we do for the Orange Jesus." Some listeners may wonder whether I have overlooked abuses of power employed by past Democratic presidents, including Woodrow Wilson's 1920 Red Scare campaign, Franklin D. Roosevelt's 1942 internment order imprisoning Japanese U.S. citizens, Internal Revenue Service audits of prominent Republicans conducted by Democratic administrations, the electronic surveillance and harassment of Martin Luther King under the auspices of the Kennedy administration, and Lyndon B. Johnson's bugging of Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential campaign, to name but a few. These abuses have been well catalogued. But there is a qualitative difference between these abuses of power and a Republican Party under the domination of a single flawed individual who poses a threat to our democracy. That threat became crystal clear on January 6, 2021, when a mob incited by Donald Trump invaded the U.S. Capitol, waved a Confederate flag, and sought to overturn a presidential election. Their aim was to stop the peaceful transfer of power, an extra-constitutional right established with Thomas Jefferson's peaceful transition into the presidency in 1801. Not even during the Civil War had the Capitol been invaded and political violence ensued, including the deaths of 5 police officers and hundreds of others with life-changing injuries. The delirious, angry rioters were convinced that the 2020 election had been stolen and saw Donald Trump's impending defeat as a political Armageddon, one that must be averted at all costs. Ashley Babbitt, an insurrectionist cloaked in a Trump campaign flag, posted these final words the day before she was killed by a Capitol police officer as she attempted to enter the House of Representatives, whose members had donned gas masks, cowered under seats, and barricaded the doors. "The storm is here, and it is descending on D.C. in 24 hours. Babbitt was an Air Force veteran who had voted for Barack Obama, but became a QAnon believer and died in the service of Donald Trump. In 1861, faced with another insurrection, Abraham Lincoln told Congress that the Civil War was a war upon the first principle of popular government, the rights of the people. Any abridgment of the existing right of suffrage, Lincoln said, is the source of all political evil, concluding, "In my present position, I could scarcely be justified were I to admit raising a warning voice against this approach of returning despotism." Lincoln's admonition is, once again, especially pertinent. In the aftermath of the Capitol insurrection, 2/3 of Americans believed the divisions within the country had worsened, and 3 in 5 anticipated an increase in political violence in the coming years. An astonishing 43% predicted another civil war was either very likely or somewhat likely, with 53% of Trump voters sharing this view. After the FBI conducted a search warrant on Trump's Mar-a-Lago property, the former president posted online that the 2020 election was irreparably compromised, and a minimal solution would be to have a new election immediately. Far from tamping down the emotions of his followers, Donald Trump continues to incite their anger and anxieties. Memory and hope have given way to fear and rage. For decades, I have studied and written about the Republican Party, beginning with The Fractured Electorate, a look at the GOP in 3 southern New England states, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, to the new politics of old values, which traced the rise of Ronald Reagan and how his emphasis on the values of family, work, neighborhood, peace, and freedom resonated with voters, to the values divide, which saw the beginnings of a partisan chasm where an emphasis on values spurred by pleasant memories of the past was giving way to a culture war that Republicans feared losing, to Still Seeing Red, which examined the creation of a Cold War party system that propelled the Republican Party into the presidency, to What Happened to the Republican Party, which traced the challenges the party faced after failing to win the popular vote in every election from 1992 to 2012, with the sole exception of George W. Bush's victory in 2004. These works, as well as the history of the Republican Party since the 1930s, read differently today in light of Donald Trump's presidency and its tumultuous aftermath. As historian Matthew Dallek notes, the radicalization of the Republican Party was contingent, halting, and gradual, not foreordinated and inevitable. Yet, from rereading that history, the anti-democratic strains within today's Republican Party trace their antecedents to events that occurred decades earlier. In his aptly titled memoir, The Gathering Storm, which chronicles the events leading up to and including World War II, Winston Churchill wrote that it was his purpose to demonstrate that the war was enabled by the malice of the wicked and was reinforced by the weakness of the virtuous. Churchill concluded that the structure and habits of democratic states, unless they are welded into larger organisms, lack those elements of persistence and conviction which can alone give security to humble masses. It is this fight between malice and virtue, between hope and fear, between memory and rage, that threatens the underpinnings of our democracy. Summoning the ghost of Abraham Lincoln, Representative Jamie Raskin noted that our constitutional democracy is the silver frame upon which the golden apple of freedom rests. That frame still holds, but its foundations are weakened. Unless democracy is vigorously and continuously defended, historian Timothy Snyder warns, we're looking almost certainly at an attempt by the Republicans in 2024 to take power without winning the election. Unless we heed the lessons taught by Winston Churchill and the wisdom of Abraham Lincoln, democracy will continue to hang in the balance. Introduction. Passions and interests. Republicans shatter a delicate balance. No democracy without parties. Clinton Rossiter, Parties in Politics in America. On January 7, 2005, an unusual event took place at a joint session of Congress called to certify the results of the previous presidential election. For the first time in 128 years, the normally placid proceeding was interrupted when the certified electoral votes from Ohio were officially challenged. Objecting were Democratic Congresswoman Stephanie Tubb Jones and Democratic Senator Barbara Boxer. The state's official count gave George W. Bush a 118,601 plurality over John F. Kerry, a clear victory. But Democrats charged that voter irregularities provided Bush with the win. In Lake County, Ohio, a handful of voters reported receiving flyers claiming they were ineligible to vote. As the charges of fraud intensified, the county's elections commissioner said, "I have had an election year I'd never thought I'd experience in my 21 years. I've had to do so much damage control." After Bush declared victory the morning after Election Day, conspiracy theories abounded that Ohio's voting machines had inexplicably switched votes from Kerry to Bush. Rising from her seat in the House chamber, Boxer argued that Congress had a responsibility to cast the light of truth on a flawed system which must be fixed now. Republicans howled in protest. House Majority Whip Tom DeLay lamented the Democratic quadrennial crying of wolf, asserting that any fraud charges were Hollywood-inspired. The supposedly wronged Democrat, John Kerry, was not even present as he was abroad visiting U.S. troops. After a 2-hour debate, Democrats conceded defeat, and the drama ended. But Republicans remained aggrieved, with Senator Rick Santorum calling time spent on the issue a travesty and declaring that Democrats were not over the 2000 election, let alone the 2004 election. Santorum had a point. Reflecting on her objection, Boxer admitted she had made a mistake in not objecting to the outcome of the Bush versus Gore race 4 years earlier. The hard feelings many Democrats had about the George W. Bush presidency stemmed from accumulated resentments after the contentious Bush versus Gore contest. The controversial Florida vote, officially certified by the Republican Secretary of State as giving Bush a 537-vote win and the presidency, was upheld by a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court. Conceding defeat after 36 days of recounts and court battles, Al Gore declared, "We will stand together behind our new president." Gore cited Stephen Douglas, who, after losing the presidency to Abraham Lincoln in 1860, proclaimed that partisan feeling must yield to patriotism, adding that the strength of American democracy is shown most clearly through the difficulties it can overcome. Gore promised to do everything possible to bring Americans together in fulfillment of the great vision that our Declaration of Independence defines and that our Constitution affirms and demands. His gracious concession gave Bush the needed legitimacy to begin his administration. Democracy had endured. But during the 36 days before the Supreme Court decision ended the 2000 election, Democrats and Republicans accused each other of subverting democracy. Given that Florida's electoral votes would determine the next president, partisan feeling swelled as Democrats and Republicans swarmed county clerk offices and battled one another in courts. Democrats argued that votes should be accurately counted, while Republicans contended for the rule of law. Gore's campaign chief, William Daley, declared, "If the will of the people is to prevail, Al Gore should be awarded a victory in Florida and be our next president."
Sample complete. Ready to continue?